Uh, with that, we'll introduce Dr. Norman Blumenthal. As I said, our introduction is going to be brief. You can go on the website to read the full introduction. So he's director of the trauma services at O.L. Zachner Family National Trauma Center, and he's a professor at Yeshiva University, the Rabbinical School, and the Furkov Graduate School of Psychology. Dr. Blumenthal, welcome again to Torah Motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's really good to be here. It's a little intimidating to be following Dr. Brum, but I'll try to do my best. I want to thank Rabbi Jay and Rebitz and Ilana for organizing this, and looking at the lineup, I feel very honored and flattered to be part of it. And I also want to acknowledge my friends Michael and Marsha Lax, who are sponsoring this. They are truly an inspiration to me and so many other people. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about vicarious trauma, and the title of my talk, which will be brief so there's time for questions, is how vicarious is vicarious trauma? And really, it's going to be following our experience in the OHEL trauma team since October 7th in terms of, in some way, finessing, if not redefining, the concept of vicarious trauma. So first, what is vicarious trauma? So sometimes referred to also as secondary trauma. It used to be referred to as compassion fatigue. I guess many people, like myself, felt that you don't get fatigued by being compassionate. If anything, you get empowered. So now it's sometimes referred to as compassion strain. But it's the experience of trauma, not for the person who is right away inflicted with trauma, by the person who is sort of one step removed. Now, that one step removed covers a lot of territory. The one step removed could be the Zaka or Magen David Adom people who arrive at the scene, or in our case, in the overall trauma team, when we come right away following a catastrophic event. It could be someone who is later on counseling the person. It could be an emergency room physician who's treating the person medically, and then to take it maybe to a maybe more distant level, it actually can be people who are reading about it, learning about it, or maybe watching it on a video or something of that sort. So that's, and what happens is, what's so interesting is that there are similarities between vicarious trauma. I'm just going to say vicarious trauma from now on, even though there's other names, and primary trauma. The similarities are that the symptoms are fairly similar, but somewhat more diminished. But the person who hears about or processes a trauma with someone else will have flashbacks and will have trigger responses and will have some of the very symptoms. I see somebody said in the chat about journalists writing about it. Yes, that's very important. In fact, there was an article, I don't have it handy right here, but there was an article written about journalists who cover the news. And one of the points in the article was that many of the media, very few of the media outlets offer any kind of services for the journalists who are running towards these kind of events. It includes firefighters, I'll get to that later, and police officers, and I said many of the other people that are involved in rescue efforts. So on the one hand, it is similar. And you can have some of the very same symptoms, sometimes even some of the shutdown, the kind of numbing that takes place for people that have experienced trauma. A key difference is that it's in contrast. By the way, I should just say in passing, for those who may be interested, there is a reference in the Bible, in Chumash, to secondary trauma. During what's called the Shira, the song that the Jews sang when they were liberated from Egypt, it says, Tipol alahem emata v'fachad, that descended upon them. And they use two words for fear, emata and pachad. And if you look at the commentator Rashi, who quotes actually in Mechilta, he said, emata ala recholkim pachad ala krovim. The emata is those that were removed, pachad are those who experienced it firsthand. So ones that say pachad were the Egyptians who were drowning in the sea, and emata were perhaps those who read it in the Moabite times. But a key difference between a secondary or vicarious trauma and primary trauma is that primary trauma is one huge event that traumatizes the person. Secondary trauma tends to be more cumulative. So let's say for the Hatzalah or for the Zaka driver or Magen David Adom who comes to it, or let's say since somebody referenced journalists, for the journalist who is covering traumatic events, it's not the one event that the person covered, but each one of these, let's say each case that an emergency room physician addresses sort of chips away at the security and the well-being of the person. So it's not the one big event, but it might be the 15th. It might be the 17th. And the reason why that's, in a way, makes secondary trauma more pernicious, even perhaps than primary trauma in this respect, is that you don't see it coming. So a not uncommon call that we will get will be from one of these very heroic medics from Hatzalah, these people who nothing phases them, vehicular accidents, severed limbs. They're the ones who can go out there. And then they'll have what would be, by their standards, a fairly ordinary call. Somebody, a child cuts themselves and needs stitches, or somebody fell and maybe broke a bone. And suddenly they're having a trauma reaction. They can't get the screams of the child out of their head, or they can't get the images of the pained person. And they'll call me. They'll say, I don't know what's the matter. I've seen everything. I've seen bullet wounds. I've seen multiple injuries. I've seen, excessive bleeding. Why would this one event so impact me? And the answer really is because each one impacted them in an imperceptible way. And this was the straw that broke the camel's back. This was the last one. In fact, I remember once in a clinic I was working, there was a secretary who worked, before she worked in our clinic, it was in a medical center, she worked in pediatric oncology. And I asked her once how the doctors cope dealing with children with cancer. And she really told me this. She said, they're just very clinical, they're very scientific, but about 1 out of 50 kids, suddenly they'll sort of zone into that one child. And if that child dies, they fall apart. So it's as if the entire grief from all those other cases catches up with them. We saw that very dramatically. Some of you may remember a few years ago, the Sassoon fire, the terrible fire in Flatbush, where 7 out of 8 children perished. And we, among the many services we provided, we met with the burial society, the Chevra Kadisha of that community, the ones who had to prepare the children for burial. And again, this was a secondary trauma. And what happened during that meeting was every other child that they ever had to prepare for burial came back to them, and they were just recalling and by the way, that's what the debriefing is like. If I do a debriefing for emergency room physicians, for police officers, firefighters, all the other events come back and start cascading into their consciousness, and therefore it's so it's like you can tell it's that cumulative effect. And in fact, the research shows, which is very interesting, is that those who are most likely to be impacted by secondary trauma are, if I was to divide, let's say, a professional, let's say I take the trauma team, my own trauma team, trauma counselors, and divide them between those who are relatively new, who are doing their first few cases, those who are sort of in the middle of their career, and those who, like myself, have been doing it for decades. The ones most affected by secondary trauma are the middle group, the ones who are sort of in the middle of their career. And the reason given is that the newer ones, they haven't had enough cases for it to sort of catch up with them. Whereas the people who are like myself, who are more seasoned, already have coping mechanisms. We have ways to sort of manage it, or we have an awareness when we're going too far. I often tell people ask me, when do I know when I'm dealing with too much? And my answer is that when it enters my dreams, when I start dreaming about my work, then I know I have to sort of pull back. But the ones in the middle, they've had enough cases that it catches up with them. But on the other hand, they haven't yet developed those kind of coping mechanisms. So the question is, where does this come from? Why would somebody who is not immediately traumatized become as if they are traumatized in because of these experiences. And it really comes from a very good place. It really comes from our natural need to connect, to interpersonally connect, along the lines of what Dr. Brahm just mentioned about his being a bit of a dinosaur and liking a live person in the room. I'm sort of similar, though I've accepted Zoom as a method of treatment. But we have a net. We're very social beings. We want to connect. If you would suddenly find yourself, if you were a guest at a table and you find yourself sitting with someone you didn't know, and you just want to get acquainted, what do you naturally do? You naturally try to find similarities, common denominators, because you want to connect to that person. So when we're with someone, when we're working with someone, and they are traumatized, we kind of try to adopt that. We try to experience the trauma ourselves, or we'll try to access our own experiences of trauma to connect to that person. So we sort of become traumatized as well. So though it sounds like a sort of deficit, it's really a strength. It's really that capacity or that need, or wish to connect and relate. But of course, the side effect is that we become traumatized ourselves. In fact, in primitive cultures, when a wife is pregnant, the man develops many of the symptoms of pregnancy. I think we in Western culture are too scientific. Maybe we don't allow ourselves to do it, with the possible exception of the weight gain, which we do it for any reason. But it's again that need to sort of want to connect. In fact, by the way, there was a very moving article a number of years ago in the Jerusalem Post about a fellow, Radai Fils, Zichrono Levarcha, who was the first medic to show up in that terrible helicopter crash during the Lebanon War, where 73 soldiers were killed when two helicopters transporting the troops crashed into each other. He was the first medic to show up. And several years later, he took his own life, and he's regarded as the 74th victim. And there's a suspicion that he himself couldn't get over the horrors that he saw. That's a very extreme case of secondary trauma. So, by the way, there's also, by the way, another aspect of secondary trauma that gets much less attention, but is also somewhat encouraging and heartwarming, which is there's also something called secondary resilience, which is that when you work in this field, when you work with traumatized people, you not only are impacted by the trauma they're experiencing, but you get to witness their incredible coping. Again, was alluded to in the previous presentation. People ask me sometimes how I could spend so much of my time dealing with catastrophe. And one of the answers I give them is I don't just deal with catastrophe. I see incredible amount of unity, love, strength that's inspiring. So it balances it, so it doesn't become so extreme. But it's, again, as for those of you doing this kind of work, while you do have to take precautions because of secondary trauma, you should also focus in your work about, you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to see tremendous amount of strength and resilience, which will be encouraging, and which is something you can internalize yourself. Now, another implication of all this work, and then I want to get to my question about how vicarious is vicarious trauma, is that it speaks to the necessity to have debriefings and to take care of yourselves. And on our team, if you go on a trauma intervention, you must, and it's a requirement, that you speak to myself or my female counterpart, Sivi Ryder, or Cheryl Chinosky, who also works with us, to process what went on. And very often I'll get the comment I'll get from members of my team, who are all terrific and all licensed professionals. They'll say, I'm fine, I'm okay. It was upsetting, but I'm all right. And what they don't realize is, yes, they feel all right, but in ways that are imperceptible, it impacted upon them. And if they don't, at this point, process, it will at one point, they'll have that experience where it comes sort of crashing into their consciousness, and they have to sometimes, in fact, stop. I don't know what, sometimes with these Satsala drivers that call me, I will tell them, you need to take 3 months off or take 6 months off. And that's like taking a gun away from a cop. It's very hard, but they are saturated. And that's how, even for myself, when it enters my dreams, I know I have to pull back. But if you can process when it happens, if you can speak it out, talk it out, and we know that a lot of trauma work is just retelling, it's just talking it out, then you're protecting yourself from it catching on with you later. Now, let me tell you what sort of happened, what an insight we had in October 7th. And I know personally, I was visiting children of mine in Montreal, and it was a very distressing event, obviously. And we very quickly, as soon as I could, we got back home, and we had that night we had a webinar for the community to help certainly the community here in North America to cope with the events that were taking place October 7th, together with Dr. Naomi Baum from Israel. And I very much presented this as, well, this is secondary trauma. We're on the other side of the ocean. And as distressing as secondary trauma. What happened was, as we went out there and as we were meeting, and I went around the country meeting with children in different schools and with individuals, it didn't feel like secondary trauma. It really felt like many people, obviously not to the extent of those who were in Kibbutz Be'eri and Nativ HaSarah, but it really felt very more like primary trauma for the people we met with, rather than secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And it's forced us to think, maybe we have to rethink this whole concept. And I came up with two possible explanations why that was the case. First of all, we're only 1 to 3 generations removed from the Holocaust. So then this had, of course, this was the worst tragedy for Jewish people since the Holocaust, and had many of the trappings, many of the aspects that we have learned with or lived with. I, as a child of Holocaust survivor, was in our home as I was growing up. So I think some of the immediacy of this trauma may have been because we're so close to the Holocaust. I sometimes tell the story. I'll tell it very quickly because I don't want to take up too much time. But in my house, when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to eat turnips because my mother, Shalom, who was a survivor, was fed turnip soup in Auschwitz. And if the capo liked you, they put a little piece of turnip in. So I knew there was this vegetable called turnips, but I wasn't allowed to have it. We didn't have it in our house. And I remember when I was an adult, invited to somebody's house, and somebody served a vegetable soup, and there was this crunchy white vegetable in it. And I didn't know what it was. And I very innocently asked what it was. And they looked at me like I had just come from Mars. And they said, it's a turnip. I spit it out. It was such a betrayal. Of course, everybody looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, I'm allergic to turnips, which, well, I guess I was. But that's how trauma that's transmitted. So so there could be, that's why. But I think there's another reason that has more it's more generalizable, which is that in today's day and age of the internet and social media, we are finding things out immediately and in very graphic ways, in a very immediate ways. It really comes right into our consciousness, right into our homes, and with nothing spared, and with boundless sources. So perhaps because we don't have to wait a day and read about it in the newspaper. So I think the fact that tragic events, catastrophic events, are in such a strong and such an immediate way penetrating us, that maybe it's not so secondary. Again, I'm not saying it's primary like what happened in the southern Israel in the Otef, but it has a primary flavor to it. And maybe what we have to do is look at it as on a continuum. Maybe it's not like, well, here's one side is primary trauma, here's one side is secondary trauma, but primary and secondary trauma kind of meet, and they're different gradations. And we may very well experience events that would have been secondary in the past in a more primary way. And in a way that's encouraging also, because one of the fears many of us have, again, it was alluded to earlier by Dr. Brom, but are we losing that interpersonal connection as we communicate more on devices, as we communicate more through texts and all that? And there's some evidence and data to suggest that's the case. But if this media, if this technology allows us to experience other people's events in a more immediate way, it can perhaps preserve or prevent the deterioration, if you will, or the loss of that interpersonal connection. But again, in terms of the trauma and secondary trauma, maybe vicarious trauma isn't as vicarious as we had previously thought. Apropos to that, I'm going to conclude with a very interesting insight I heard once from the actually head chaplain of the New York City Police Department. She told me that police officers, at least in New York City, have much more secondary trauma than firefighters. Now, this is also another aspect that I didn't get into, which is that very often people who do trauma work are self-selected for being tough, for being resilient, for being thick-skinned. And therefore, when it gets to them, sometimes it's that they have to fight it or resist it. I mean, if you are, I'm guessing, in the police department, and you go to your superior and you're crying and falling apart about something you saw, they may be very sympathetic and may give you a referral to the local mental health professional, but they're not going to get that promotion to be an officer because they want toughness. But she said the police officers have more secondary trauma than firefighters. Now you'd think, why? They both deal with life and death events. They both deal with catastrophic events. What would be the difference? And I think the difference is really very telling and very important, especially for those of us who do trauma work. In a police department, this squad car goes to this trauma. This squad car goes to that one. This police officer attends to this one. In the fire department, when they get a call, they go together as a kila, as a community, and they come back together. So they have each other to process it. Whereas the police officer, it's more disparate, the different kinds of work that they do. And so therefore it speaks again to coming together, processing, supporting each other, which maybe is obviously going to be a very integral part as we, and especially Israel, heals from October 7th. Okay, let me take some time to Rabbi Kalman, do you want me to do the
Sure.
chat? You want to?
Yeah. Take a look at the chat first, and then we'll open it up to, people to speak up. But there are a few questions
Okay.
in the chat. Thank you.
So obviously, so somebody brought up the question of anti-Semitism, which should and can be a presentation unto itself. It's what we're dealing with that a lot on our team, and especially in the local Jewish schools. Anti-Semitism is a trauma, primary and secondary, and it doesn't even have to be an actual assault, which unfortunately has. I mean, the rise in anti-Semitism, in some communities has tripled in occurrences. But it can also be the invalidation that takes place when the media so misrepresents the situation in Israel. I just don't have the time now to go into it. I would just say very quickly, the approach that I like is more of the historical approach. I think that when you place these events in the broader context of Jewish history, it does sort of dilute its impact, but it definitely is a trauma. Okay. So Israelis who visit, because right. So again, people are triggered. The college campuses today are really a hotbed of assault and this kind of invalidation, which one has to brace oneself and one has to prepare oneself for facing that. And it's painful. It is painful. Again, maybe next conference there should be presentations dedicated to anti-Semitism. I think that's all I see. Am I missing something? Okay, I think I got all the chats.
One of them, there was just a point. I'm just going back that interesting point that triggers are often being some type of a personal connection, where if you have a child the same age as the patient, so that will trigger something. Just think that's an interesting comment that makes a lot of sense, of course, unfortunately. Okay, anybody have anybody questions I'd like to ask, or a question, Vakasha? Quiet, okay.
Okay. I must have traumatized everybody. So
Or you did such a, you covered all the base. Yes, okay, Kimona, Vakasha.
So thank you for this incredible presentation and also the one before. I'm thinking about the difference between police and firefighters is that generally, I assume police are dealing with person-on-person violence, and firefighters are dealing with maybe mostly accidental fires. And I'm thinking about the trauma of anti-Semitism, but especially October 7th, is the destruction of the faith in the other and the sense of being hated. And I think that may add a whole other level of trauma than, let's say, earthquakes or fires. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
Sure, sure. So it's interesting that when they measure the levels of secondary trauma, the highest secondary trauma, let's say for people who are engaged in rescue, the highest levels of secondary trauma are situations that are seemingly caused by another person. A violent assault, a drunk driver, or something like that, versus those that seem, now again, from a religious person, we know everything is dictated by God, but on the surface, that seems to be almost what the insurance companies call an act of God, or a sort of natural event. So, an earthquake, or for that matter, somebody who was injured doing a very routine activity where there was no cause by anybody else. It's more tolerable. The other thing about natural disasters, and we at OHIL had dealt with, with Hurricane Sandy and with some of the floods, the fires in California, is that it's more communal. Again, look, as we get back to the firefighters and the police officers, that it's shared. It is somewhat random sometimes. It's very interesting when you go to these sites that sometimes you'll see total devastation, and right in the middle you'll see a house that wasn't even touched. But because you're doing it and you're dealing with it in a communal way, that does help. If we think about it in terms of Israel, yes, it's a community, despite some differences, et cetera. It is a shared communal event. And in Israel, it also was a sense of purpose. In terms of survival, in terms of Israel being created, if you will, at least formally after the Holocaust. So there is so it takes away some of the sort of randomness of the catastrophe, and all these have bearing on the impact. I think your point's well taken. I didn't think about that in terms of police officers and firefighters, that firefighters will have, relatively speaking, less of those man-to-man infliction of trauma. I think that's correct.
Okay, there are a few more questions in the chat box, of course.
Okay, sure. Okay, so how to deal with collective memory in our long history of horrible suffering over thousands of years. So it in a way, what your question seems to indicate, that would make it harder. In a way, it makes it easier. There's a lot of, I'm sure this has been alluded to at this and previous conferences on trauma, but all the work that's come out originally from Emory University on ancestry, and how people who are aware of their ancestry and aware of their personal, family, and national history, and can place events that occur in that broader context of history, have more resilience than those who do not or choose not to. So the collective memory, that aspect of especially, for us as Jews, our very turbulent but heroic history. If we place the current occurrences, the current events that are occurring in that broader context, it sort of dilutes it. So the collective memory helps, even though the collective memory is painful. Eruptions of an open and some diaspora that are ongoing and worsening in some ways. Yes, the anti-Semitism is. Please don't minimize it. It is distressing. Many people feel that as Holocaust survivors are dying, that we got a reprieve because after the Holocaust, and that's disappearing, and age-old anti-Semitism is emerging, and it really is a traumatic event. And again, maybe in the spirit of what we just said, if we meet together, and by the way, the worst thing is to be passive if something's traumatic happens, and therefore it's an important way of healing is to respond. Now, respond may not be able to gather troops and fight the anti-Semites in a physical way, but in terms of reporting it, protesting it, contacting politicians, there are still, we're not totally hapless victims as we have been in the past. And that's good both in terms of combating anti-Semitism, but it's also good in terms of coping. But obviously, I think we need here one presentation on anti-Semitism. Okay, 1 second.
You were going up. If you go down, I think there are a few comments that came in later.
Oh, I see that.
starting.
I'm seeing this now.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Gotcha. Okay.
Should I go through them, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Okay.
Go through them. Yeah.
Okay. Is there a specific way of processing together that can help most in groups? Yes, I want to tell you that, and this is something. It's in a way the profundity of something that seems very simple. Just talking about it. When you put traumatic events when they occur, sort of impact on on the very primitive parts of our brain, in the fight or flight part of our autonomic nervous system, and when you put it in words, you take it into an area where we can manage it. Obviously, there's a lot of research on this, where it now becomes something. It's still upsetting, but you can sort of hold in your hand and look at it and discuss it. And that's really what debriefing is. Our debriefing with our staff is just going over what happened. One of the nice things I try to do when we do a debriefing with staff, and it's amazing what comes out. Usually towards the end, I'll turn to the person or the team that we're meeting with. I'll say, so what did we learn? And it's so incredible how in every trauma intervention that we do, we just had a really hard one this past week where a catastrophic event occurred in a local high school. Every one of them, we come away with new ideas or new insights that we hadn't anticipated, that we hadn't seen before. And that chips away in the horror, because at least something doesn't undo it. At least something good comes from it. So those are the kind of things you need to do. And you have to seek it out yourself. If you're exposed regularly to trauma, if it's not a formal part of the program that you're part of, or you're not part of a program, then you do need to seek out opportunities to talk about it and discuss it. The fact that it was attacked the entire country has not been mentioned, and there was an additional traumatizing of aspect. Yes, absolutely. This is, the intent was destruction. The intent was annihilation, was genocide. And that's what I'm saying. Maybe I mentioned it as being connected to the Holocaust, but I think that is definitely most relevant. Can you please address children suffering from second trauma, how those around them can minimize it? So I'm not sure if minimize it is the word we should use. Is that we have to teach our children how to manage it and how to gain mastery over it. And by the way, to legitimize it, I will tell you that about a week or two after October 7th, one of the first schools I went to was an all-boys elementary school in Miami. And they asked me to speak to the kids about the events. And I got up there, and it was about 206 to 8th grade boys who got out of class. So you can imagine the energy that was in that room. And I told them who I am and reminded them why I was here. And then I said to them, how many of you are scared? And I raised my hand. And about 3/4 of the kids raised their hand. And I said, how many of you are sad? And I raised my hand, that about the same number, a little less, raised their hands. It's okay. It's okay to be traumatized. It's okay to be scared. It would be, that's normal. In a way, as I indicated earlier, it shows your connection. But what do we do with it? And how do we master it? And by the way, some of the debriefings that we do with adults or children is crying, sometimes laughing, sometimes just bemoaning the kind of recent events and how frightening all this is. But once you put it into words, it becomes manageable, and that's what we try to do. Roy, come and just tell me when to stop. What about becoming numb? The system's overwhelmed. I know sometimes I'm watching horrific news and don't have much emotional somatic response. First of all, numbness is a good response. I mean, listen, when I go in to a traumatic to do an intervention, a traumatic event, if I have to go and do a death notification, I'm a wreck beforehand. I'm a wreck afterwards. When I'm in there, I'm very focused. I'm almost robotic, because you need that. You can't, if I would be fully cognizant of what I'm facing, I would be ineffective. So numbing is an adaptive response. It's one of several. It's interesting that you actually raised that question, because for someone like myself who's been doing trauma work for over 30 years, which is pretty impressive since I'm only 35 years old. But for someone who's been doing that work that long, my fear isn't so much being traumatized, but becoming callous. Like, another trauma, another vehicular accident. And I really very much focus and check myself, take my pulse to make sure that's not happening. Okay.
You have another 4 minutes, so we're okay.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was a very good point. Thank you, Shira. Yeah, it's the briefing. I focus mostly on the talking, but if you do this kind of work, you need outlets. Well, and the outlets can vary from person to person. But for me, it's hiking. But for somebody else, it could be exercise is an excellent one. It could be music. It could be art. It could be woodworking. It could be yoga. You need that. You definitely need those stress inoculation kind of. I guess everybody does, but and could it be somatic? Yes, the body is very responsive to trauma. So someone else might have a somatic response. As I said, my response is where I guess what I'm aware of is when it enters my dreams. But yes, you have to be aware of the mind body and the impact it may have on you in terms. And by the way, to have healthy outlets. I mean, not alcohol, not eating. Not attending trauma conferences, all those kind of things that are harmful to your health. Okay. I hope that was helpful, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And okay, well, Dr. Katz will begin, I guess, in about 3 minutes. And thank you, Dr. Blumenthal, really, and Dr. Brahm, I see you're still here, really, for honoring us and really with your expertise. And you see by the result and the questions, really important. Your insights are much appreciated. Thank you very much. Okay, Dr. Katz, say hello. And if everyone wants to stretch for a couple minutes, and then we'll have an official break after the Pelkowitzes speak at 12 noon. But so two more talks, and then we'll have a 15-minute break, and then sort of the afternoon session. Okay.